Welcome back. I'm Byron White. I'm Vice President for University Engagement, Chief Diversity Officer here. I see a lot of mostly familiar faces, people who have been to listen to other speakers in this series. We appreciate you joining us again for Dr. David Morass. I will tell you just, David, for many of us who've been thinking about ways universities and communities connect, Davis is a very familiar name, partly because his book, Beyond the Campus, which was published in 2001, really is sort of a foundational text for a lot of the thinking about how universities and communities figure out ways to work together, and really looked at cases that were emerging and partnerships that were emerging. He has since really focused around not just universities, but other kinds of anchor institutions. And so we're gonna, in some ways, as our series moves on, this shifts our attention a little bit away from the way just we organize ourselves internally to the way the world outside the academy connects from the vantage point of communities and how that works. David is the founder and president of Marga Incorporated, which does consulting around the country with foundations and institutions and universities and others around partnerships and how they work. He actually just has written 4 books, the 4th of which has just come out, which is Strategic Public-Private. Oh, there it is on the table. And so he's continued to do that work. And in his capacity at Marga, in partnership with the Netter Center for Community Partnerships and Ira Harkavy at University of Pennsylvania, has helped to put together this national anchor institution task force, which is starting to really drive a lot of the strategic thinking on the role of anchor institutions and the opportunities for community transformation through that work. And so that is his topic for today. And so with that, I'd like to introduce David Morass.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Yes. All right, good. Good to be here on this rainy day. Hopefully it'll clear up soon. So, but thank you so much. I've been here for several hours now, both today and yesterday, and getting to see the campus a little bit, and it's been a pleasure, and people have been very gracious and welcoming, so I appreciate the Cleveland hospitality. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of anchor institutions, as Byron mentioned, and talk about universities as anchor institutions, and how communities and anchor institutions can collaboratively work to address some of the critical needs that communities face. And in a lot of ways, I think some of this kind of work is essential, maybe more essential than some people have expressed. And I also think it's an opportunity. I think there is a real opportunity for universities and other types of anchor institutions to really help fulfill and strengthen their own missions and their own priorities by way of collaborative partnerships in communities. So that's just a theme that I think is going to run through a little bit of what I'm going to say. So thank you very much. So I just wanted to say just a few things about higher education and the context, and these are all critical areas that are very relevant to what higher education is dealing with, right? So you can think of connecting in communities and partnerships in communities as a nuisance, given that there are all these challenges out there facing colleges and universities in terms of budgetary challenges and even the notion of place as far as universities are concerned, and the fact that there is so much online education going on right now. Is the place-based aspect of higher education threatened in some way, shape, or form? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that people are asking, and people wondering about the value of higher education as well. And so when you've got all those kinds of challenges out there, why add another thing like community partnerships? It's going to be time consuming, it's going to, things of that sort. So I think it's important to really look in the context of all the challenges higher education faces and wonder about the degree to which anchor institution engagement and partnerships in local communities can actually be an opportunity to address some of the challenges that higher education faces, rather than one extra thing that makes life in higher education even more difficult. So I think that's a part of the challenge that we all face and we all have to really think about. And I do think that there are some interesting trends that position higher education very interestingly in these times, and could be significant opportunities going into the future, such as the fact that we are kind of in a knowledge economy, and there really is a need for highly skilled labor, and labor that really in some ways can be nurtured through the higher educational experience. And so what does that mean for higher education? And are there opportunities in community partnerships that are in fact connected to that as well? And just the fact that economic growth is really based on knowledge. And so higher education and so much of what comes out of higher education has been driving much of the global economy. So while there are constraints, there are also opportunities. And then there's some realities in municipalities. Municipalities everywhere, all across the country. Of course, it's not all equal, but there are some real strains on local budgets. And municipalities are really looking to their local institutions that have certain amounts of assets as potential partners to help address the kinds of critical issues that government is sort of charged with addressing. So I think that's another interesting trend that's a contextual factor that could be really relevant in thinking about this further. So anchor institutions, just as a notion. So what are we talking about, anchor institutions? Is that a good thing, or is it something else? And when I say anchors, and when a lot of people in the field who are working on the role of anchor institutions say it, we're really talking about institutions that have a vested interest in their surrounding areas. They are rooted in their local communities. It is difficult for them to leave their communities. So they therefore have a real stake in what goes on in their localities. And so part of the reason that's important is because as we think about transforming local communities, how do we in some way leverage the fact that there is that ongoing vested interest for anchor institutions in a way that can be beneficial to a number of different parties in local communities? And there are various types of anchor institutions. I mean, we think of institutions of higher education partly because they are significant. They remain in their areas for substantial amounts of time. They have significant land holdings. They have a substantial economic capital. They have physical capital. In many ways, they have a lot of employees. They have a lot of contracts with local businesses. These are some of the characteristics that people think of when they think of anchor institutions. But there are lots of other factors as well that can come into play in terms of, for example, institutional mission. So something like a community foundation can be anchored in a surrounding community because its mission is tied to place. It is tied to a locality. And so if it leaves that locality, it ceases to exist as it exists in its mission. It would become an entirely different entity. So there are lots of factors to take into account when you think about anchor institutions. But you think of museums, you think of libraries, you think of lots of other entities, hospitals, that are rooted and consistent in their surrounding communities. So that's just part of the anchor institution definition. And I mentioned some of the characteristics of anchor institutions: significant employers and purchasers. They have a lot of capital and bring tremendous assets to the table. And it's interesting that many of today's anchor institutions are nonprofit organizations. And that is a part of the intriguing story when it comes to anchor institutions. Because in many cities, particularly a lot of cities in what some people would refer to as the Rust Belt, like here in Cleveland, the anchor institutions of the past would be manufacturing corporations. They would be steel mills, they would be paper mills, they would be lots of different types of manufacturing companies. And certainly manufacturing still exists. It hasn't disappeared. But as capital left communities, as it flew away from communities and went to other parts of the country and other parts of the world, you really began to ask the question, well, okay, if those manufacturing companies are not present, then where are the jobs? Where are the opportunities? What is the heart of the local economy? And so anchor institutions sort of rose to the surface for a lot of people as they were beginning to think about what are the strategies, the economic strategies for localities into the future. Where are the institutions that you can actually build on in a way that can be beneficial to surrounding communities and that can actually drive local economies? And so anchor institutions, ironically, are sort of nonprofit organizations in a lot of contexts. Certainly there can be for-profit entities that are loyal and rooted in surrounding communities, but often the market forces drive different dynamics for those institutions, which oftentimes force them to leave or take parts of their work to other places. And so anchor institutions are a little bit more reliable and a little bit more rooted in that sense. So that's another aspect of anchors. And institutions of higher education as anchor institutions is really critical in this space. You know, as I look at what goes on in the field, as was mentioned, some of the work that we do with the Anchor Institutions Task Force, which is a membership association, which I'll talk a little bit more about. This entity is really driven by people who are at institutions of higher education. People who are at colleges and universities have in a lot of ways catalyzed and anchor institutions movement around the country, that they have really thought about this idea of being an anchor institution as something that is critical to solving community and economic challenges. And another thing I want to say about the way the Anchor Institutions Task Force has thought about anchor institutions is that there is an objective reality of being grounded in a community and having a lot of capital and having a lot of jobs and contracts. That's an objective reality. But there's an aspirational idea as it relates to anchor institutions. So you can be a grounded institution that's rooted with a lot of capital, but not necessarily an institution that is substantially engaged in the surrounding community. And so a lot of us see the need to have ongoing activity in a field of work of anchor institutions, but we are trying to encourage a different type of activity and a different type of philosophy as it relates to anchor institutions, whether they're universities or other types of institutions. But colleges and universities really stand out among anchor institutions because they bring so much capital to the table, and it's such a breadth and such a variety of different types of capital, from the human to the physical to the intellectual and beyond,